Hello, I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and before this video starts, I wanted to give you a little bit of context. So in his philosophy of religion class at Huntington University, Dr. Tedla Woldayohnnes invited Dr. Joshua Sijuwade to present his essay Grounding in the Existence of God with a response from Professor Graham Oppy. Graham Oppy's been on the show a bunch, and he's awesome. You definitely want to hear what he has to say. So in addition to that, Professor William Hasker and Dr. Susana Gómez were also participants in this discussion. They're also in the video. So as for the format of this video, it opens with a 50-minute presentation from Dr. Sijuwade of his argument to the class, followed by a 50-minute dialogue between Sijuwade, Oppy, Hasker, and Gómez. And by the way, really sorry in advance for the poor quality of video. At times, Zoom certainly has its limits. But in any case, please enjoy this video.
So thank you very much, guys, for coming and listening to this discussion between myself, Professor Oppy, and others. So the title of my presentation is called Grounding and the Existence of God. And this corresponds to an article that was written and published last year. And so I'm just going to sort of go through some of the main points of the article and the argument that I formulated. So I tried to put forward an abductive argument for God's existence. And I also, one of the main aims as well, was I was trying to show how theism, the claim that there is a God, can play a central role in metaphysical theorizing, so in contemporary metaphysics. So I'm going to walk through some parts of the argument. Sometimes I might have to be more brief than unfortunately necessary, just so we can get through this and get onto the dialogue. So the first part I'm going to go through is the explanatory framework that I utilized in formalizing the argument. Now, when we understand explanation at a general level, I believe that there are at least two types of explanation that people can put forward. There is something called a general causal explanation. So this will be an explanation that invokes an entity that we call the cause, an event that we call the effect, and a causal relation that links the cause to its effect. So a general explanation for the occurrence of a certain phenomena, i.e. an event, will invoke a what, which we call the cause, that truly brought about the phenomenon, and a why, a causal relation that explains its efficaciousness. So for example, if we had an entity called Susie, so a person called Susie, and she decided to throw a rock at a window and it broke, Susie would be the cause, and then the window breaking, an event, would then be the causal effect. And what links Susie, the cause, to the causal effect is a relation of causation. And so if we want to know why the window broke, we'll just simply say that Susie did it and she caused the window to break. But then the more important type of explanation that we're looking at today, and the one I really want to focus on, is something called a metaphysical explanation. And this is one that invokes certain entities that we call the ground and its grounded effect. And then it also invokes a grounding relation that connects the ground to its grounded effect. So more specifically, a metaphysical explanation for the existence of a certain entity invokes a what, i.e. the ground, that non-causally and synchronically depends upon, and a why, i.e. a grounding relation that explains the reason for the dependence of the former entity on the latter. So we have two types of entities, and one depends upon the other, and there is a relation of grounding that links them together. Now, this relation is normally conceived of, as we'll see later, as being a non-causal relation, and it's a synchronic dependence relation. That means that the entity that is the ground is grounding another entity at that specific time. So if we have an example, let's say we have Socrates, and then we have something called Singleton Socrates, which is his set, which has Socrates as a sole member. What links them together is a relation of grounding. Singleton Socrates exists in virtue of Socrates, who serves as its ground. And so the key thing that's linking them together is this specific relation of grounding. And so if I want to know why Singleton Socrates exists, I'll simply invoke Socrates and say, well, he's the ground of this Singleton set. And so specifically, just to reiterate the point, we're looking at the second type of explanation in this specific argument. But then other distinctions can be drawn when it comes to explanation. And this is distinctions that can be applied at the general level and at the metaphysical level. But specifically, we're going to be looking at distinctions when it comes to forms of metaphysical explanation. One form of metaphysical explanation is a partial metaphysical explanation. And this is where an entity partially grounds another entity. So if you have, for example, an H2O molecule, the existence of the H2O molecule is partially explained by one entity, such as a single O atom. And so that single O atom serves, oxygen atom, serves as the partial grounds for the existence of the H2O molecule. But then a full metaphysical explanation is one where an entity is fully grounded by other entities. And so let's say we're going with that example of the H2O molecule again. The existence of the H2O molecule is fully explained by a set of entities, one H atom and two O atoms. And so why, let's say, this H2O molecule exists is because it has these atoms serving as the full ground of their existence. And so we don't need to invoke any other entities to explain why that H2O molecule exists. But then a more robust form of full explanation, full metaphysical explanation, and the one that we're going to really focus on today is something called a complete metaphysical explanation, or what I've retermed it as a fundamental explanation. And this is where an entity is fully grounded by another entity, but with the latter entity not being dependent upon any other entity at that specific time. So today we're looking at something called the grounding relation. So we can take that, for example, now as the entity under focus. And then a fundamental explanation for the existence of the grounding relation could be, for example, God. God is the reason why the grounding relation exists. But then God himself exists as an ungrounded entity. He does not depend upon any other entity at that time for his existence. Or there could be other options on the table, as we're going to see, such as the cosmos being the reason for the grounding relation, or certain mereological atoms. At the moment now, it's not so important about the options. It's just understanding that when it comes to fundamental explanation, we are looking for a full ground of the entity under focus, but the grounds of that entity do not have any grounds themselves. They are ungrounded. Their existence, in a way, is inexplicable. So what we're looking at today, just to reemphasize the point, is a certain type of explanation, metaphysical explanation, and a certain form of that called a fundamental explanation. So moving forward then, someone could ask, well, how do we know when we've come to a true explanation for something? How do we know we've come to a true fundamental explanation? Well, I believe that the main way to understand a true explanation is one that has the most theoretical virtues. The explanation that has the most theoretical virtues is the one that's more likely true. And so at a more specific level, following someone like Richard Swinburne and Professor Oppy, I believe that the best way to understand this is an explanation should minimize theoretical commitments at the fundamental level and maximize explanation of the data at hand. But how we understand this trade-off between minimizing theoretical commitments at the fundamental level and maximizing explanation is by utilizing, I believe, a certain inductive criteria. And so I'm going to run through some of the central elements of this inductive criteria so we can understand how it can play a part in the argument. So the first element is what is called the criterion of predictive power. So if an explanation is true, it should lead us to expect the data that we have when otherwise this data would not be expected to occur. The second one is the criterion of background knowledge. A true explanation should be one that fits very well with other explanations taken to be true in neighboring fields. And so the entity that's invoked in the specific explanation should be of the type of entity that is taken to exist in other areas and have some explanatory value in those other neighboring fields. And then we have the criterion of scope. Now, normally in an explanation, in inductive investigation, the criterion of scope will play a very important part because the narrowness of explanation is always better because the less you're trying to explain, the more likely you're going to be correct about what you are explaining. However, when it comes to fundamental explanations, this is not going to play any part, this specific criterion, because we are looking for an explanation of everything else that exists in reality. And so all of our candidate explanations are going to have a very, very wide scope. They're going to try and explain everything. And so unless we're going to get rid of all of our candidates at the beginning, we cannot utilize this specific criterion. So this criterion would actually drop out. And so what is more important is the criterion of parsimony or simplicity. And the criterion of parsimony focuses on the quantitative and qualitative parsimony of an explanation. And it does this at an ontological level and an ideological level. Now, the way that I specifically understand this is by conceiving of it through something called Schaffer's laser rather than the more famous Occam's razor. Now, because I'm utilizing this maybe more new understanding of the criterion of parsimony, I'm going to just break this down a little bit so we can understand it better. So Occam's razor generally states that you shouldn't multiply entities beyond necessity. So we should be restrictive of all types of entities in our explanation. But Schaffer's laser is a further specification of this. What it says is that we shouldn't multiply fundamental entities beyond necessity. And so we should be restrictive at the fundamental level. The entities that we have at the fundamental level should be more limited. But we can be permissive when it comes to the derivative entities, the entities that exist beyond the fundamental level. We can be more permissive of the number and kind that we postulate. And so when comparing how economical theories are, one should then compare how many fundamental entities or kinds an explanation posits, and not generally how many entities or kinds are posited overall. Now, you might be thinking, well, why should we make the specification when we already have Occam's razor? Well, the interesting thing is that this understanding, this specific specification of the principle of parsimony is something which is now in some areas of metaphysics being signed up to by some of the leading metaphysicians. And so I'm just going to run through some of the names that we have here. So obviously Jonathan Schaffer, who the principle of parsimony was put forward by, he stated that I think the proper rendering of Occam's razor is that just going to minimize it. Yeah, sorry. I think that the proper rendering of Occam's razor should be do not multiply fundamental entities without necessity. And then we have Karen Bennett, who states built entities do not count against the simplicity of a theory. And the built entity is just derivative entities. So she's saying they don't count against the simplicity of a theory. Equivalently, only fundamental entities count against the simplicity of a theory. Ross Cameron states, the principle of ontological parsimony must tell us to judge theories by what entities they emit to their fundamental ontology. Theodore Sider writes, the epistemic principle should be restricted to theories about the fundamental nature of the world. And then Daniel Corman notes, the most parsimonious theory is the one that explains all that needs to be explained using the fewest resources. Since fundamental objects are those in terms of which everything is explained, it only makes sense to measure ontological parsimony in terms of which items are taken to be fundamental. So we have some of the leading metaphysicians signing up to this understanding of Schaffer's laser. But it's not just because we have some philosophers affirming it as a reason that we should adopt it, but we do also have some arguments that have been put forward in favor of Schaffer's laser. Now, I'm not going to go through any of these just because it will take us too far afield. But if anyone's interested, I can point you to different areas where they are exposited. But there are some arguments that have been put forward to actually say we do need to adopt in our theorizing, in the metaphysical context and other contexts, we do need to affirm Schaffer's laser instead of Occam's razor. And so just taking that on board, we can then understand the criterion of parsimony in a certain way. Firstly, quantitative ontological parsimony. A true theory or explanation should postulate the fewest number of fundamental entities, fundamental objects, properties, and relations. Qualitative ontological parsimony. A true explanation should postulate the fewest number of fundamental kinds of entities that will be fundamental ontological categories, objects, properties, and relations. Quantitative ideological parsimony. The fewest number of fundamental theoretical primitives should be postulated by a true theory. Now, theoretical primitives are just undefined terms. So we should have few undefined terms about the few fundamental entities and kinds that we are postulating. And then also qualitative ideological parsimony. A true explanation should postulate the fewest number of kinds of fundamental theoretical primitives. So with that all in hand, what we can then understand is that a candidate explanation is a fundamental explanation and a terminus in explanation of a certain set of metaphysical data if it can provide an optimal trade-off between minimizing theoretical commitments at the fundamental level and maximizing explanation of the data. In a more slogan format, we can say a true fundamental explanation is a simplest explanation fitting with our background knowledge that leads us to expect the data when otherwise we will not expect this data to occur. And so this is our framework and the framework that I'm going to be utilizing in our analysis that we're going on to. And so before we sort of move into that aspect of comparing explanations and theories, we need to also understand, well, what is the thing that we're seeking to explain? What is the phenomena that we are looking at? And I've termed this the explanatory target. Now, in order for us to understand this explanatory target, it will be helpful to just paint a picture of the metaphysical background in which this explanatory target finds its place. And this background is called Metaphysical Foundationalism. Now, certain metaphysicians believe that reality is not just a single leveled entity. Reality is multi-layered, where there are various levels to reality, and they are hierarchically arranged in a certain way, where we have the less fundamental entities existing at the higher levels, and as we descend down to the lower levels, we find more fundamental entities. Ultimately, at the bottom of this sort of layered structure, we then will arrive at some absolutely fundamental entity or entities. And what is connecting each of these levels is something called a relation of grounding, which I spoke about earlier. Now, I'm just going to put this image up so we can understand a sort of dummy illustration. Now, I don't believe this illustration is wholly correct, but it's very helpful in sort of illustrating the main point of this background. So let's say we have the top level economics. So if we're just looking at the left, and economical theories are very important in order for our world and our societies to operate effectively. And so these theories about goods and services are very important. However, these theories exist because of the human minds that are thinking and theorizing about these things. They are the ones that are grounding the theories of goods and services. So the goods and services are grounded and dependent upon for their existence on the human mind. And let's say we're assuming some form of dualism just for argument's sake. The human mind, the sensations, beliefs, and things like that. The human mind is then grounded on the brain states. So it's grounded on the human brain. And then the existence of the human brain is grounded by our chemical structure. And then our chemical structure is grounded by, let's say, some quarks. And so what we have here is a layered structure where we have the less fundamental entities existing at the top. And as we descend lower down, we come to more fundamental things. And then we arrive at the bottom to an absolutely fundamental entity or set of entities, which are then ungrounded. They are not existing in virtue of anything else. And so what's connecting all of these levels together is a relation of grounding. So our layered structure of reality is where we are then going to locate our explanatory target, this specific picture that I just illustrated. And so what I'm seeking an explanation for, what our explanatory target is the instantiation of a relation of grounding within the layered structure of reality. Basically, in a more simple way, I'm seeking an explanation for why does this relation of grounding exist? Why does it exist at any point in time? And it's connecting all of these entities. Why is it such that we have reality being hierarchically arranged in that specific way instead of just being the single leveled entity? Well, grounding is the reason why we have that structure, but then why do we have grounding? That's the question. Well, in order for us to even start answering that question, we do need to understand what the nature of grounding is. Now, generally, grounding is conceived of as a primitive relation that has certain formal properties and fulfills a certain role. The formal properties of grounding are that it's asymmetric, irreflexive, transitive, necessitating, and it's analogous to causation in a certain way. That means it functions in a similar way where causation is diachronic, grounding is a synchronic relation. And then the role that it fulfills is that it links the more fundamental entities to the less fundamental entities, as I noted before. Economics is linked, or the economical theories are linked to the human mind by a relation of grounding. But then grounding also backs an explanation for the existence of the less fundamental in virtue of the more fundamental. So it backs an explanation for why the economical theories exist. Why do they exist? Well, in virtue of the human mind, which grounds their existence. So we have this certain role and formal properties of grounding, but then something I think is very important to just flag up now is that I'm not just speaking about an esoteric relation that's at the side of metaphysics, because somebody might be thinking, well, why are we speaking about grounding? Because a lot of people have never heard it before. But grounding, and a very important thing at the moment, is that grounding is a very it's a specific notion that's at the center of metaphysics. And how we can see that is by the individuals that I've put on the PowerPoint in front of you being grounding realists. So grounding realist is someone who believes in the notion of grounding. And we have some of the leading metaphysicians in the world who have all signed up to this idea that grounding is something that exists and needs to be theorized about. And so what we have then, and I've just noted that Matthew Clark and David Liggins have noted also that the notion of grounding has now been established as a major concern of metaphysics. Now, this is not to say that all of those metaphysicians all agree about what grounding is understood as. It's just the idea that they affirm this notion being important and we need to theorize about it. But again, it's not just because we have a wide acceptance that we should ourselves accept it, but there are also reasons why people have put forward for us believing in this relation of grounding. Now, again, I'm not going to go through them, and I will point people to other areas that they can see some arguments for grounding existing, but there are various arguments that can be put forward that will sort of have tempted, well, not tempted, but actually push these people to affirming it and could push you to affirming its existence as well. And so just sort of that then in hand, I just need to make one more distinction before we sort of move on to our analysis. And this will play a part later on. It's not so important now, but it will play a part later on. So it's good bringing it up now. So there is a division amongst some of those philosophers that I've noted where some people fall into the camp of grounding monism, which is the idea that there's only one type of grounding relation. And then there's grounding pluralism, which is the idea that there are many types of grounding relation. So you'll have people like Jonathan Schaffer, who will affirm this idea of grounding monism. There's only one kind of grounding relation that plays a part in our layered structure of reality. But then there's grounding pluralists like Kit Fine and Jessica Wilson, who will believe actually that grounding is a context-dependent notion, that grounding in different ways is going to come in different kinds. So when we have the human mind being linked to the human brain, that's one type of grounding relation. When we have the quarks being linked to the chemical structure, that's one kind of grounding relation. And so there'll be different grounding relations for different contexts. And so that will play a role later on in our analysis. And so then just to emphasize our key question, what we're looking at and what we're seeking a sort of an answer for is this question: is there a fundamental explanation for the instantiation or existence of the relation of grounding? And if so, what is it? Now, I believe that there are a few options on the table. There's one candidate position called primitivism. And I've called it a position because it's not an explanation. It's not seeking to explain anything. But primitivism is one candidate option. But then we have three anti-primitivist explanations. And what I mean by anti-primitivist is just saying that actually grounding needs an explanation. And so some of the options on the table will be theism, priority monism, and priority pluralism. Now, we're going to go into our analysis of these specific candidates, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. I will have to rush through some of the nitty-gritty points, but for those who really want to understand it further, you can look deeper into the paper and see the arguments for them. So primitivism was put forward by Jonathan Schaffer, and it's just the idea that the relation of grounding is fundamental. That is, there is no explanation for why there's any relation of grounding. So these grounding relations exist, but their existence is inexplicable. In some sense, their existence is just a brute fact. So this doesn't mean that all grounding relations are fundamental. Some might be derivative, but there will be a certain fundamental set of grounding relations which do not have any further grounds in a way. They don't have any explanation for them existing. So that's a primitivist position. But then moving on to our candidate fundamental explanations. So theism is the first one. Now, theism is a candidate fundamental explanation. Now, obviously, theism can be understood in many different ways, but at the central sort of core of it is just the claim that there is a God. But even that claim that there is a God is itself controversial. What does that mean? Well, the way that I define God is simply as a metaphysically simple omnipotence trope. Now, even though I might have said that might be simple, it's not simple. Metaphysical, simple omnipotence trope is not a simple notion, but I'm not going to go into great depth about defining all these terms, but I'm just going to briefly run through some of these key things in this understanding of God as a metaphysically simple omnipotence trope. So God, firstly, is an omnipotence trope. Now, a trope in contemporary metaphysics can be conceived of in two ways. Some people conceive of tropes as properties, and they are called modifier tropes. And then some people conceive of tropes as particular objects. The modifier tropes, particular properties, are non-self-exemplifying entities. And then the particular objects, which are called module tropes, are self-exemplifying entities. Now, I take God to be a module trope, a particular object that is self-exemplifying. And an interesting thing, an important thing is, majority of philosophers believe that tropes are powerful entities. They are powerful in a way that they can bring about certain manifestations. And so tropes can do things. But the key thing with a module trope is that they are self-exemplifying entities. That means that they have the character that they bestow upon other things. So a redness trope is red. A hotness trope is hot in a way. So the key thing here is that God is conceived of as a certain type of trope, a module trope. He's a particular object that is self-exemplifying. But the key thing as well is that he's powerful like other tropes. But the distinction between him and these certain general tropes would be that the power that he has no limitations except for logic. And so any manifestations, the manifestations that he can bring about are not limited except by logic. So that's why I call him then an omnipotence trope. But then he's also, in a certain sense, metaphysically simple. Now, tropes are conceived of generally as metaphysically simple entities. That means that they are non-composite. They are not made up of proper parts. And so in the context of God, that means that all the attributes that God is ascribed with are identical to him and to each other. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, what attributes am I talking about? Well, we normally would say that God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, perfectly free and perfectly good. And there are other things that will be added there that are of importance. But the key thing to note here is that all of these terms, in the way that I'm using them, can be defined. They're not taken as analogical terms that are stretched, but they are defined terms. They are not taken in any primitive sense. They are defined in a certain way. Now, this doesn't mean that these definitions are foolproof. No, there are many counterexamples that can be brought up. And so there'll need to be further fine-graining of them. However, just for now to understand, they can be defined. But the key thing as well, because God is metaphysically simple, all of these attributes are identical to God as a trope and to each other. Now, you might be thinking again, well, how can I make sense of that? How can omnipotence be identical to omniscience? Well, I'm not going to go into that because, again, as always, it will take us far afield. But I will point people to an article that I wrote called On Divine Simplicity, where I try and put forward a coherent model of how we can make sense of this. And there are other models that you can adopt as well. But the key thing now, just to understand, is that God is understood in this specific explanation to be a fundamental entity. And he's fundamental because he's metaphysically simple, he lacks parts, and also he's omnipotent. He has no limitations to his power except for logic. So then moving on to our other candidate explanations on offer, we have priority monism and priority pluralism. Now, these were put forward by Jonathan Schaffer, and also you can find some of this in the work of Peter Simmons. Now, these two candidate explanations are mutually exclusive. So you have to sort of sign up to one of them. You can't have both. Now, one thing that we can understand at the beginning is that there is agreement between both of these explanations. And the agreement is that whatever is the fundamental thing is identified as the universe. The spatio-temporal manifold is the fundamental thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about our universe. It's just saying whatever is the totality of everything is spatio-temporal in a certain way. But where there is a division amongst these two explanations is about fundamentality. And the way that this can be put forward is as a question. What is prior, the parts of a whole or the whole itself? Now, normally we would say, well, it seems to be the parts, but some people might say actually it's the whole which is prior. And what I mean here is not temporally prior or causally prior, but about ontological priority, fundamentality. And so when this is applied then to the context of the universe, the debate then is about how should we cut up the universe? Should we keep the universe as a single fundamental entity, and so we leave it uncut? And so the universe is the single fundamental thing. That is priority monism. But then priority pluralism says, actually, no, we need to cut up the universe into little bits and pieces. And those little bits and pieces are the fundamental things. And so more specifically, priority monism is just the claim that the universe, so the cosmos, is the single fundamental entity. And this single fundamental entity can be conceived of in a certain way as the complete spatiotemporal manifold. And so every concrete object that makes up the universe, like myself and yourselves and tables and chairs, we are all identified as spatial regions of the cosmos. And so we are proper parts, or parts in a way, of the cosmos. But then priority pluralism is sort of the opposite view, which says actually, like I said, we need to cut up the universe into little pieces. And so what actually exists fundamentally is a collection of mereological atoms. So there is a near infinite amount of mereological atoms, and these can be conceived of in a certain way as point-like particles, or more specifically, according to Peter Simmons, as module tropes. So the tropes I spoke about before, we have a near infinite amount of these objects, which then make up all other concrete objects. And so they are proper parts of us, they are fundamental, and we are ultimately decomposable into these atoms. And so then, just a summary point on this, priority monism is taking the idea that what is fundamental is a single fundamental thing that we call the cosmos. Priority pluralism is the idea that what is fundamental is a collection of mereological atoms that make up the tapestry of reality. So with those sort of options laid out, we can then move on to our analysis. So our analysis will start off by looking at theism. Now, I believe that theism has great theoretical virtue. And why it does is because it minimizes theoretical commitments at the fundamental level and maximizes explanation at the data at hand, that is our explanatory target. Now, how it does this is through the fulfillment of the inductive criteria. And so I'm going to just briefly whiz through how it does fulfill it. But again, please read the article if you want to see arguments in more depth. So firstly, we can see a fulfillment of criterion 1. That's a criterion of predictive power. And how we can see this is firstly through a few things, a few steps. As I showed before, God is defined, one of the attributes that he has is perfect goodness. He would do a best action or kind of action if there is one, many good actions and no bad actions. So he's a perfectly good being. He will inevitably do good things if the options are there. But then also we have something called the diffusiveness principle, which is a famous principle, ancient principle in a way, stems from sort of the work of Plato and goes through the medieval period to Aquinas and Bonaventure and others. And it's just basically the idea, and there are ways of supporting it, maybe with intuition or other things. And it's just the idea that goodness is necessarily diffusive of itself. So good things will spread their goodness necessarily in varied ways. Okay, that's the principle of diffusiveness. So given that God is perfectly good, and we have this holding of the diffusiveness principle, and then given an assumption that's plausible that existence is a good thing, what we will then have is that if there is a God, he will necessarily bring about other entities. And given that he will necessitate their existence, there will then be a relation of grounding that connects them together. And so these entities will be derivative entities that derive from him in a certain way. And what will connect them together is a relation of grounding as a synchronic dependence relation. And so what we then have is that the grounding relation comes along with these entities. And so if there is a God, we should be led to expect with a level of certainty that there will also be a grounding relation. So we have the fulfillment of the criterion of predictive power. But then we also have a fulfillment of criterion 2, which is the idea that the entities invoked by our theories should mesh well with other theories that are put forward. And this can be found very well done by theism, because as I said, God is defined as a trope, and tropes are entities that are found throughout metaphysics. Now, I don't list all the philosophers who have signed up for the idea of tropes, but I have cited them in the article itself. And it's a varied range of philosophers who would say, actually, tropes have great explanatory value in our theories in metaphysics. And so tropes are the types of entities that are found throughout metaphysics. Doesn't mean everyone holds to them, but they are not sort of just new objects that we were just brought in for this specific case. Tropes are entities that are affirmed to have some role in metaphysics. And so the type of entity that God is an entity that fits very well with other types of entities that have great explanatory value in neighboring fields. So we do have this fulfillment of criterion 2, which might not be had by other conceptions of God as a spirit or something like that. Then we have the fulfillment of criterion 4, where theism is quantitatively, qualitatively, ontologically, and ideologically parsimonious. Why it's quantitatively, ontologically parsimonious? Because it postulates the fewest number of fundamental entities. It postulates one fundamental object, a single omnipotence trope, that has 0 fundamental properties. Because all of the attributes are identical to God, he does not exemplify or instantiate any properties at all. So what we have is the fewest number of fundamental entities. Then we have qualitative ontological parsimony. We have a commitment that needs to be made to actually 0 kinds with theism. Because if we're going with ontological categories, many philosophers believe that tropes do not exemplify kinds or categories. Some philosophers will say we can have a no category ontology when we are using trope theoretic theory. So technically, you can be committed to 0 ontological categories if you want to. And then also there'll be 0 kinds of properties and relations that this entity will then fall into. But then if someone doesn't like that and says, oh no, we need a category type of ontology, then you only will have to be committed to one category, the category that will allow tropes to exist within it. So maybe the kind trope or something like that, or the category of objects. That's all that you will need in order to hold to this. So what we have is 0 or 1 kinds as a maximum. Then we have quantitative ideological parsimony. We have 0 theoretical primitives. Each of the attributes, as I noted earlier, are defined. They're not taken as primitive or analogical terms. And so they're defined. We don't have any theoretical primitives. Or if we have any, then we might have 1 when it comes to the existence of God. But again, that's the fewest number that we can put forward. And then we have qualitative ideological parsimony, 0 kinds of theoretical primitives, because we're not using any primitive notions, or 1 if we're referring to God's existence. So in summary for this, theism minimizes theoretical commitments at the fundamental level and maximizes explanation. Theism is thus the simplest explanation, fits with our background knowledge, and leads us to expect the instantiation of the relational grounding in the layered structure of reality. Okay, sorry, just swiftly moving on. So we go to primitivism. Now, I'm going to be very brief with this, but we'll go through some of the key elements. And what I believe about primitivism is that I do believe that this explanation or position, lacks theoretical virtue. And why it does is because it maximizes theoretical commitments at the fundamental level and minimizes explanation of our target. How it does this? Because it fails to fulfill each of the criteria. And so what we have is firstly a failure to fulfill criterion 1. Why we have that is because we should not expect there to be any relational grounding that is fundamental. So in our layered structure of reality, we should not have any expectation of this. Why we shouldn't is given the holding of a certain principle that's been affirmed by certain metaphysicians and leading metaphysicians, so such as Theodore Sider, the purity principle. And the purity principle states that fundamental notions only contain fundamental things. Sider stated this as saying, facts about the relationship between the fundamental and the non-fundamental must themselves be non-fundamental. Now, how to best understand this is when we're looking at definitions of fundamental entities, we should not find any non-fundamental notions in those definitions. But the interesting thing is that the grounding connection relation is defined as a relation that connects the fundamental to the non-fundamental. So certain philosophers like Sider and Karen Bennett have said, well, grounding cannot be fundamental because it doesn't abide to this plausible principle called the purity principle. And so you can either have the purity principle or you can have fundamental grounding relations, but you cannot have both. And so if we are taking the purity principle on board, as certain metaphysicians want to, then we should not expect there to be any fundamental relation or grounding relation in our layered structure of reality. And then what we have is a failure to fulfill criterion 2. And why we have that is because the relation of grounding does not seem to fit very well with our background knowledge. And why it doesn't is because it doesn't seem to fit well with a principle that's been affirmed by certain metaphysicians. And this is the principle of modal recombination at a sort of fundamental context, where it states all logically possible combinations of contingent fundamental elements are metaphysically possible. Now, the interesting thing is that this principle was put forward by Jonathan Schaffer himself, where he stated fundamental actual concrete objects should be freely recombinable, serving as independent units of being. Thus, each should be, in Hume's words, entirely loose and separate. Now, this has also again been affirmed by Karen Bennett, and in this sort of context, it's the idea that anything which is fundamental should exist in an ungrounded way and be independent. And because it exists in this sort of independent way, it shouldn't be modally constrained in any way. It should be loose and separate in this specific sense. But the issue that you have is that grounding doesn't operate like other contingent fundamental things, because grounding is supervenient upon the grounds. And so what you have is a modal constraint on the instantiation of a grounding relation. But when fundamental contingent things should exist, they shouldn't be modally constrained in that specific way. So if we have this principle of recombination in play, and we take all contingent fundamental entities to be sort of loose and separate in this way and modally free, then we can't have grounding being classed as fundamental as well, because it wouldn't fit with our understanding of these other contingent fundamental entities. So what we have then is, if you affirm grounding in this way, you're not going to have something that meshes well with our understanding of other contingent fundamental entities that play a part in other theories and metaphysics. So you seem to have a lack of fit with our background knowledge. But then we also have a failure to fulfill criterion 4, the criterion of parsimony. How we see this is because we have quantitative ontological complexity. What we have in the layered structure of reality is a need for a high number of relations within our layered structure of reality. We need many relations, many token instances of the grounding relation in order to connect the entities. So when we had that illustration before, we had a relation for the economical theories and the mind and the brain and the chemical structure and quarks. So we had all of these numbers of relations needed to be posited in order to just make sense of that small layered structure. But you can even try and imagine now with your mind, if we're talking about all of reality, all of the grounding relations that need to be posited. So what we have then is that we don't have the fewest fundamental number of relations. So we have ontological complexity in a quantitative sense. But we also have qualitative ontological complexity. And this is where then that distinction between monism and pluralism comes in. So if you affirm grounding pluralism, as some philosophers want to, then you also need to have many different kinds of grounding relations, many different fundamental kinds of relations within our layered structure of reality. So again, with that illustration, you'll have one kind for the economical theories in the mind and one kind maybe for the quarks and the chemical structure. So again, just maximizing that for all of our reality, we're going to need many different kinds for different types of contexts. So we have qualitative ontological complexity. But then we also have quantitative ideological complexity, as there's a need for many undefined notions to make sense of these primitive relations. So we're going to need to, in our theorizing, to express and utilize many primitive terms to make sense of even these primitive relations that we are positing. So we seem to have this complexity there. But then also, given that, we also have qualitative ideological complexity, because if you're assuming pluralism again, there'll be need for many different kinds of primitive notions for these different kinds of relations that we are positing. So in summary then, primitivism seems to maximize theoretical commitments at the fundamental level and minimizes explanation. Primitivism is thus a complex position that does not fit with our background knowledge and does not lead us to expect the relation of grounding to be instantiated in the layered structure of reality. A sort of last analysis here. So what we have then is priority monism and pluralism as candidates. And again, I believe that these candidates do not have theoretical virtue. They maximize theoretical commitments at the fundamental level and minimize explanation of our target. Again, how they do that is through failure to fulfill our inductive criteria. So the first one, they fail to fulfill criterion 1. There should not be any expectation at all that there will be a grounding relation given the truth of priority monism and pluralism. So given the entities that are posited, the single fundamental cosmos or the mereological atoms, we should not expect there to be a relation of grounding that connects them to the other entities, because what needs to be posited is a parthood relation. But parthood is not grounding. And this is affirmed by people like Karen Bennett, who will take a composition or parthood relations to be distinct from other building relations like grounding. But also you can see this when it comes to the formal qualities. Parthood seems to have different formal properties from grounding, such as parthood being symmetric and grounding being asymmetric. So what you seem to have is what we should expect is there to be parthood relations that connect the cosmos to the material objects, which are its parts. And we should have parthood relations connecting the mereological atoms to the material objects, which they make up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that these should be grounding relations. There shouldn't be any expectation of a grounding relation, given the truth of these specific explanations. So then moving on to failure, the failure it has to fulfill criterion 2, background knowledge. Priority monism, pluralism do not fit very well with our background knowledge. Why they don't? Firstly, for priority monism, and again, I'm not going to go into this, it's very, very complex, but priority monism, according to certain philosophers, does not fit very well with other research projects in the philosophy of physics and in theoretical physics, because it seems not to go well with some research projects in quantum gravity, like loop quantum gravity. And why it doesn't do this is because for these ideas, priority monism takes the universe or the cosmos to be the single fundamental entity. But some of these research projects in quantum gravity are positing the idea that actually the fundamental structure of reality is non-spatiotemporal. And the spatiotemporal manifold is something which is an emergent quality of these fundamental structures. And so given this sort of dualism in play here, philosophers like Baptiste Leibniz has stated that priority monism, with its commitment to a fundamental space-time, is at risk of being empirically refuted by the forthcoming physics. So if you want to affirm priority monism with this idea of the fundamental space-time manifold, then you seem to have to let go of some of these important ideas in other areas. It doesn't seem to mesh well with the philosophy of physics, theoretical physics, and there might be other things related to that as well. But then with priority pluralism, we see a lack of fit with background knowledge in a different way. Because if you want to affirm priority pluralism, you seem to have to be committed to a very controversial principle in metaphysics called the principle of unrestricted composition. Now, this principle of unrestricted composition just simply states that when there is a plurality of things, these plurality make up a whole. So this can be literally crazy. You can have my body and then your bodies, let's say in America, in Australia, and other places. And then let's say you have a random person's toe in India. That random person's toe in India, your body and my body make up a whole because we are a plurality. And it can get even more crazy. You can add a cow and chicken to it, and this thing is going to get absolutely crazy. And so why some philosophers then have looked with disdain with this principle is because of some of the implications of holding to it. And that's led certain philosophers like Ned Marcosian to state, choosing among alternative philosophical theories always involves a cost-benefit analysis. But to many of us, such cost as accepting brute compositional facts or omitting genuine vagueness into the world are relatively minor when compared to the triple whammy associated with unrestricted composition. In light of all of this, the choice for many of us will be clear. One way or another, composition must be restricted. So what we have is a commitment here to this controversial principle. Now, why you have to be committed to this principle is because you can ask yourself this question. Priority pluralism says we have a near infinite collection of mereological atoms. Now, why do these mereological atoms make up any whole? Why are they not just independent, loose, and separate? Why are they not just free floating in certain ways? Why do they make up bodies and things like that? But then when you have the principle of unrestricted composition here, it makes sense because we have a plurality of atoms. They then can make up a whole in certain ways. And so you seem to have to be committed to this principle to make priority pluralism work. But the issue that we have is that for many philosophers, what we need to affirm is a principle of restricted composition. So if you want to affirm priority pluralism, you seem to have to be committed to controversial things in metaphysics. And so we don't seem to have a very good fit when it comes to our understanding of contemporary metaphysics if you affirm this specific idea. Okay, so moving on to the last bit of our analysis, we then have also failure to fulfill criterion 4, the criterion of parsimony. Why we have that is because there's quantitative ontological complexity. Priority pluralism states that there's a potentially infinite number of objects. So we don't have the fewest number of fundamental objects. We have a near infinite amount of mereological atoms that make up the layered structure of reality. These are conceived of as module tropes, and there is an near infinite number of them. Priority monism states that there's a potentially infinite number of properties that are pinned down to the cosmos. Now, priority monism does state that there is a single fundamental object, the cosmos, but it also conceives of the cosmos as being the spatiotemporal manifold, and every object is a spatial region of it. And so then all of the properties that we have, according to Schaffer, are pinned down onto the cosmos itself. So the cosmos has all the properties of other material objects. So what we then have is a potentially infinite number of properties that are then pinned down or instantiated by the cosmos. So what we have then is not, again, the fewest number of entities given these properties. But then we also have qualitative ontological complexity. Priority monism commits one to need at least two ontological categories to make sense of it: substance and attributes that inhere in the substance of the cosmos itself. So you might have that, and then you also need to be committed to kinds of properties to make sense of its properties. And so what you have then is this qualitative ontological complexity, but then we also have quantitative ideological complexity for both of them specifically. Priority monism seems to posit, according to Schaffer, a primitive pin-down relation, as I stated, where the properties are pinned down onto the cosmos. Again, it's not defined by Schaffer, so it seems to be primitive notions that he's assuming here. But even if that's not very important, we also have relations of grounding, according to Schaffer. And again, as I said before, grounding is a primitive relation. So we need a lot of primitive terms to make sense of this for the relations when it comes to priority monism. So we have quantitative ideological complexity. We also have this, though, for pluralism, because there's going to need to be a potentially infinite number of primitive notions to make sense of the mereological atoms. But then also you'll need the same thing for the relation of groundings. So you seem to have a lot of ideology here. But then given that, we also have qualitative ideological complexity, because we need many different kinds of primitive notions to make sense of the primitive pin-down relation or relation of grounding, the mereological atoms. And so you seem to have, again, a lot of qualitative ideological complexity here. So in summary then, priority monism and pluralism seems to maximize theoretical commitments at the fundamental level and minimizes explanation of our data. Monism and pluralism are complex candidate explanations that do not fit with our background knowledge, do not lead us to expect the instantiation of relation and grounding in the layered structure of reality. So in conclusion, theism, unlike primitivism, priority monism and pluralism, necessitates our data, fits well with our background knowledge, and postulates the fewest number of fundamental entities, one object and zero properties. And unlike these alternative candidate explanations, it also postulates the fewest number of fundamental kinds, zero, and utilizes the fewest theoretical primitives or kinds of primitives, zero as well. But if you have to be committed to one, you'll have one kind and one primitive or kind of primitive as well. Again, it's the fewest number. So in comparison to primitivism, priority monism, and pluralism, theism is thus the simplest explanation of our explanatory targets. It fulfills our inductive criteria to a greater extent than any of the options that I put forward, and thus should be taken to be the fundamental explanation for the relation of grounding. So just the last point on this, when we had that image before, we seem to have to stop it, and a lot of people stopped at the physics category. But what I believe, because of the theoretical virtues that's given to this sort of explanatory framework by theism, we need to then descend past the physics category. And we need to then stop at the explanatory stopping point, which is now in the theology category, because what exists in that category is an absolutely fundamental entity who's ungrounded and who then provides an explanation ultimately and fundamentally for everything else in that layered structure of reality. So that's sort of my presentation. But there are some questions that I just put there just so some people might be thinking through this whilst we're dialoguing. And yeah, someone could ask a question, well, what issues can be raised against the methodology put forward, against the explanatory target or the comparative analysis? And what other possible explanations fit our criteria better? Because the explanations that I looked at are what are sort of existing in the contemporary metaphysical literature. So I am very interested, and this is a learning thing for myself to understand what other explanations could fit it better and how could we sort of do this trade-off with our explanatory and theoretical virtues. Okay, thank you very much, guys. That's my long presentation done.
Okay, so Now,
Sure.
response. Okay, now Professor Oppy, it's your turn. You can respond to any part of the presentation.
So the primary question that's being addressed is, why is there grounding? Okay, that question has a presupposition built into it that there is grounding. Assuming that there is grounding, I think that the right answer to that question is because there has to be. And I think that's where explanation finishes. Once you hit necessity, there's no point asking why is it necessary, because what's necessary is so no matter what, and any explanation would be appealing to a what of some kind. So it seems to me that that's going to be the right explanation, right? There's grounding because there has to be, explanation's going to end there. What about the prior question? Is there grounding? And if so, how are we to understand it? So what I want to do is just talk about what appears on the first page of the paper for a while. So I think it's clear that there are various different kinds of relations that are exemplified in the world that look like they're candidates to be grounding relations. It's not clear that they issue in a single layered structure for reality, but each of them will admit of some kind of explanation, I assume. So the first example that we're given is that mental facts obtained because of neurophysiological facts. Now, I actually think that mental facts and processes just are neurophysical facts and processes. So I'm inclined to read this as thinking that identity is one example of a grounding relation. If you really insist that the mental and the physical are on different levels, and then it turns out that they're identical, it looks like the way that we're going to be understanding that is as a kind of grounding relation. Now, why is there identity? Why are there identities? I think the answer to that question is because there has to be. There has to be something. Once you've got something, it's identical to itself and not to anything else. So the explanation of why there are identities is just going to be cashed out in terms of an appeal to necessity. What's the next one on the list? H2O molecules are grounded by H and O atoms. Well, the relationship here is clearly mereological. Hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms are parts of water molecules. If that mereological part-whole relation is a grounding relation, then although there are various ways that you can argue this, so let me give you a kind of quick and dirty argument that that will be controversial because of something that Joshua said earlier. Suppose you've got two non-overlapping things. Suppose you think that there's got to be at least two non-overlapping things. Give yourself unrestricted composition and you're guaranteed that you've got mereological relations, right? They just have to be. So again, the explanation of why there's instantiation of the part-whole relation is going to be because there had to be. And we can go on down this list. There's a bunch of things that look like they're candidates to be grounding relations. So I've made a small list looking at some of the other examples here. I think that fundamental normative claims are necessary. I think that there's kind of modal relations. I think that the semantic supervenes on the non-semantic. It looks like supervenience is going to count as some kind of grounding relation. I think that some statues are constituted by clay. That makes it look as though constitution is going to count as a kind of grounding relation. I think that money has diverse physical realizations. That makes it look as though the kind of realized relation is going to count as a grounding relation. And though this one might be a little bit more controversial, red's a determinant of the determinable colour. It looks as though the determinate-determinable relation is also a grounding relation. And I might add, as a kind of addition to this, you might actually think, if you're going to suppose that there's a grounding relation, that the right way to think of it is as a determinable, where the determinants are things like identity, mereology, modality, supervenience, constitution, realisation, and so on. So, given this much, it's not clear what's left of the kind of explanatory question with which we started. Why is there grounding? Well, if that question is why is there at least one instance of one of the grounding relations, I'll just point to identity and say it had to be, and that will be the explanation, and we'll be done. We don't need to appeal to anything else more complicated. One other thing that I want to point out, and then I'll actually just throw to Joshua to respond to this initial comment. In the discussion in the initial presentation of the claims about ontological priority, we find words like because of, based on, due to, in virtue of, makes, and so on. And the idea seems to be that these expressions are in good standing. But at least when I was a student, all of these words were called weasel words. They were words that you had recourse to when you didn't know exactly which well-behaved relation was the relation in question, whether it was identity or mereological or supervenience or constitution or whatever. And so I'm kind of sceptical about the idea that there's a unified idea that lies behind these various things. Now, in the paper, Joshua mentions that there are people who are kind of sceptical about grounding in the way that I am. And he mentioned a couple of the people in the course of his talk, in particular, Jessica Wilson has expressed the kind of view of the pluralistic sort that I've been suggesting. It matters if you go for pluralism over the kind of unified view for things that come later, where we seem to be thinking about grounding as a single relation that admitted of a single explanation. If we're grounding pluralists, there's no reason to suppose that there's going to be a single explanation, and there's good reason to think that there'll be different things to say in different cases. Okay, so that's just the beginning of an initial comment.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for that, Professor Oppy. I really appreciate some of that clarification there for your point and position. Yeah, so just so I did note down the necessity one, but I think we'll focus on that first sort of point before we sort of go on to the other one. But yeah, so when looking at these sort of examples, so these are sort of these paradigm examples that are put forward, because when individuals are trying to sort of introduce this idea of grounding, they normally say we can latch onto it by these paradigm examples. But there's been a big movement by a lot of philosophers to say we need to move off of that, because it only allows us to see that there might need to be something that underlies these semantic terms. As you were saying, like these seem like weasel words, but a lot of philosophers are sort of saying, well, it seems to capture some type of priority here that we want to make sense of, because there is sort of a direction to things here, where there's one thing that seems to be dependent upon another thing, and it's asymmetric in that sort of way. And sort of grounding is being put forward then as this sort of explanation of this connection between them. When it comes to the identity, obviously that would be what some people might say, well, it seems to be an identity relation here, and the identity wouldn't be a grounding relation given the formal properties that identity has, which will be lacked by generally what grounding relations are conceived of being. But there are philosophers like Schaffer himself, who is a physicalist, who would say we need to, because of some explanatory gaps when it comes to the identity position. I myself am not very I would even say well read on the philosophy of mind to argue for one position over the other. But for those who would say that the identity position doesn't seem to be correct when it comes to, let's say, mind and neurophysiological facts, we need to hold to some form of grounding relation. So Schaffer put forward this idea of grounding physicalism, where grounding relations play a part in making sense of a physicalist view of the mind sort of body problem. So I would say, well, for those then who are saying the identity position has issues, and so we're taking numerically distinct things here, grounding for a lot of philosophers seems to be a relation that's connecting these two things together. So for those who do assume the identity position, maybe that paradigm example might not hold, but there would be other paradigm examples that some philosophers would say does seem to be fitting into the grounding category. So the famous one that's stated there about set theory. So, and I used it in my sort of presentation, Kit Fine really latched onto that with ontological dependence in the 90s. But then it's played a big role in sort of grounding literature to say, well, this sort of set membership relation seems to be a grounding relation in a way because of the formal properties that seem to be in play here. Now, again, that might be up for argument as well. But the key thing here is that's why I made the distinction between pluralism and monism, because grounding, as I said, there's a lot of disagreement. Monism and pluralists are fighting over which is the best way to conceive of it. But even if we take a pluralist view, it seems to be the case that there is this relation of ontological priority here. So even if we allow for identity in some cases, there seems to be some form of ontological priority where there is a less fundamental thing that's dependent upon a more fundamental thing. And so what accounts for that? That's what I'm trying to say. And it doesn't have to be univocal relation. It could be a different relation for each context. So someone like a pioneer of this is Kit Fine, and he is a pluralist, not in Wilson's sense of taking there to be many different small grounding relations, but Fine would say that there are at least, a small set of different grounding relations, but they play a part in these paradigm examples. So I think pluralism can still be a position that's put forward, but then it needs to be accounted for. Why is there this connection of ontological priority in some of these cases? So I don't know.
So a couple of quick comments. Yes. The first one is that I'm not impressed by the set membership example, because on nominalist grounds, I'm very sceptical that there are sets. And I think that actually matters for the strategy of the paper, because you give this detailed explanation of one case, and it's exactly that case, but that case is completely controversial.
Yeah.
Right. It would have been better I think, when you were to have picked a different, less controversial case.
Yeah.
So that's what I want to say about so that was actually the next comment that I wanted to make was, what about nominalism, right?
Sorry, just a quick one with that point. Sorry for interrupting. The reason I did it, and it's something sort of a peripheral aim, is I'm trying to say, well, some of the central things that metaphysicians are doing is leading to the conclusion that I'm trying to go for with theism. So I even though I might not even myself be persuaded by some of the examples, I'm saying these are the examples that the leading practitioners are using to illustrate grounding. And then given that, it's leading to this conclusion. So maybe for a certain audience, it might be persuasive, but not for everyone. Yeah.
Okay. So the other thing I wanted to say was about, it seemed to me that you wanted it to be the case that there was one relation, grounding, ontological priority or something like that, that divided the world into levels. And there are definitely people who are sceptical about that. So the person that I know best who's sceptical about that is John Heil. He thinks that that is just a completely misbegotten idea to think that reality is stratified in that kind of way. And I have some sympathy for John's position. So I wondered what you thought about that.
Yes. So I have very briefly looked at John's stuff. And I do agree with you that there are skeptics, and there's other skeptics in the literature who would question it. So people like Catherine Koslicki, who would say that seems to be the case, that grounding is not necessary. And maybe it's not a structuralist sort of view of reality. But what I would say is I think the predominant position is metaphysical foundationalism. So what it is, the idea that there is this layered structure that terminates in some level of fundamentality. But there are skeptics of this, and there may be skeptics of how to understand it. So someone like Kosliki, for example, would say maybe the relation of grounding is not needed. It's a relation of ontological dependence or essential dependence. But there is an assumption here that there seems to be a leveled reality. And someone like Karen Bennett, who might say against John Hull, is it just seems also to be quite evident that there are things that are more fundamental ultimately than other things. So given that there is just this sort of fundamentality of certain entities, there just seems to be a layer to reality that we have. So yeah, I do agree that John Hull and other individuals will be skeptical, but I do believe that a lot of philosophers would say metaphysical foundation seems to be the position. Infinitism is sort of another view that people take, that there is a structure, but it just doesn't descend in a level of fundamentality. But foundationism seems to be the main sort of position. And someone like Ricky Bliss, another philosopher, would say what the problem is actually not metaphysical foundationism. It's that metaphysical foundationism is an assumption that's made by a lot of metaphysicians without argument. And so she tries to put argument, but she does evidence in her one of her articles that it is the assumption that's made by a lot of people. And Kelly Trogdon is another person in another article who said that as well. There's an assumption, but we have no argument. We need to move to an argumentative phase for foundationalism. But it does seem to be, for some philosophers, that the predominant position is foundationalism, that there is a level. There's levels of reality, and then is there a fundamental level or not? That's up for sort of debate. But I do agree with you. There are skeptics, and there'll be arguments that can be put there. So again, I just would say that then maybe my argument is, again, for someone who would say, well, this predominant metaphysical foundationalist view, where does it lead us? What's the best account for that? So even though there might be skeptics to the whole picture of reality that's been painted.
Okay, you just mentioned the view, which I'll call gunky pluralism, that there's no bottom level. If there's no bottom level, nothing's fundamental. If all that matters is how many fundamental entities you've got, then surely that's the winner, because the answer is at zero in all respects.
Yeah. So so it would have simplicity in a way. So you might have the point that there is not a fundamental entity. But what you will have is, I think, you will lack explanatory power. So again, just going, and this is in another paper, sorry, it's not in the grounding paper, but it's another paper that was linked to this that I wrote. But it's the idea that there is something left over if you don't have a fundamental entity. And that is for why there are any derivative entities anyway. So what you have is at each level, you have a full metaphysical explanation in virtue of an entity that's more fundamental. So economical theories, and then the mind, and so on and so forth. But what you don't have is that you don't have any explanation for why there is an instantiation of the kind derivative entity. Why is there? Because each time we're just positing another derivative entity, but we don't terminate in anything fundamental. So someone like Bliss and others will say it seems to be the case that we don't have, we have explanation left over that seems to be needed. But then also Kelly Trogdon would say, and Schaffer himself, interestingly, would say we do need to posit that fundamental level and not go with infinitism because we don't have a source of reality. Sorry, we don't have a source to the reality of the derivative entities. What we have is just reality, but where is that source ultimately terminating it? It just seems to be that we're positing more levels without getting to any source of that reality. So 2 points were there. There needs to be an explanation for the instantiation of the kind derivative entity, which is not had by positing another derivative entity. Bliss calls that the kind instantiation principle. And then Trogdon would say, and Schaffer, that there seems to be a need to posit a source of the reality of the derivative entities, because a derivative entity is just deriving reality from something else that's derivative, but you don't ultimately have that source. So that will be another reason to say we just can't keep on just going down levels. There has to be some level of fundamentality.
Okay, maybe I want you to say a bit more about that, because that just sounded like an expression of prejudice against the infinite. I should say it's not my favoured view, but that's because I think that way more counts than what's fundamental when you're what's at the fundamental level, assuming that there are levels when you're comparing the virtues of theories. But it seems to me straightforward that if all that matters is what's at the fundamental level and you don't have a fundamental level, then you're going to win. And of course you have an explanation for why there are contingent entities of, level entities at higher levels, because there are entities at lower levels. It's just that explanation regresses. There's nothing wrong with that explanation. Maybe what you mean is something like, ultimately there's no explanation, but then there would be a way of getting around that as well. And one way to go would be to marry this to kind of necessitarian, right? There had to be some set of levels, right? Which is not implausible. And then that's added in. It depends a bit whether you think you get that for free or not. But it doesn't seem as though we're now going to have a view that does as catastrophically badly as you thought priority monism and priority pluralism do. It's going to be a view that's extremely competitive, because if there's anything in there, it'll be just this one claim that there's a certain amount of necessity. That will be it. That's all you need. Everything else you got for free. And now you've got an explanation of everything, because what's necessary is so. You've got an explanation there.
Yeah. What I was trying to say with the first point about Bliss's instantiation principle. So it's the idea that what we have is, we seem to have, in a lack of a better phrase, an explanatory leftover. Because what we have is that with each level, the terms I was using before, we seem to have a full metaphysical explanation. Why does this less fundamental entity exist? It exists in virtue of this more fundamental entity at a lower level. But then each time all we're invoking is a derivative entity. But then someone can ask the further question, the leftover question of, well, why are there any derivative entities as such? And then you said, because it's necessarily so. But then I'll have to have a good reason to say, well, why is it necessarily so? I know you would say to me, necessity doesn't require explanation. But then someone could say, well, why am I positing a necessity there? Is there a good reason to posit a necessity there? Not to say that necessary entities need an explanation, as you would say, but why should I posit a necessity? Should we just freely posit necessities when we want to because it fits with an explanation better? Or is there good reason to say that actually this, for example, economical theory and this mind is necessary? Or are you saying the levels are necessary and the entities within the levels aren't necessary? So what is necessary in that specific layered structure reality? The entities, the levels. So I think more will need to be said there about the necessity sort of option.
Right. So every time that you make a posit in a theory, it's a cost. If you posit a necessary entity, that's a theoretical cost, always. But all you have to, or if you posit a necessary connection, right? It's always a theoretical cost. But your method was, all we do is we tally up the theoretical costs and then we see what's explained and what isn't. If you postulate the infinite number of levels, you explain the existence of everything at every level, right? So if there's anything that's left over, you can think about trying to kind of sweep that up by supposing that what's necessary is that there be an infinite number of levels, something like that, one simple necessity posit. And then everything else, by the way that you are adding things up, comes for free because you have nothing else that's fundamental except that posit. I mean, I'm not recommending this as a theory. I'm just thinking that I'm taking your methodology, applying it to a particular case and getting out an answer that you don't like.
Yeah. No, I was very helpful for that because I do want to, pushback helps in clarifying points. But for me, it still hasn't sort of answered that question of why each level is structured in this specific way of fundamentality. And you're saying to me that the structure itself is necessary. But then my problem, number one, my additional point is that wouldn't fit at all with contemporary notions of grounding, because grounding and the whole field of foundationalism, they take grounding or this structured reality to be contingent. So number one, it wouldn't fit with the ideas that we are theory. No, it's fine if you want, but it wouldn't fit with the other ideas of grounding. And so I don't know if that theory itself would fit with the criterion of background knowledge. Seems not to fit with what's widely accepted about the nature of grounding and things like that in the structured reality. But then secondly, outside of that, I don't think it still provides a reason for the totality of the structure itself, and why also there are those entities that exist within that layered structured reality. Because are you then going to make the further posit that actually the entities in the layered structured reality are necessary themselves? So it's not just a structure, it's also the entities themselves that fill up that structure that are necessary as well. Would that be, or would it be that they're contingent? Because then you'll have a structure. So if they're a contingent, for example, then you'll have a structure that's necessary that doesn't have any entities within the structure, which seems to be very strange when the structure is there in virtue of, because grounding is a supervenient in the sense that it's connecting entities. So it seems like you can't have the structure without the entities. But then if you're taking the structure itself and the structuring relation to be necessary, then you have to also have that for the entities as well. So then the whole of the layered structured reality becomes a necessary thing. Or not, I don't know if it'll lead that way in your mind or something like that.
So I wasn't thinking so, but maybe at this point, I should see whether Bill or Susana wants to ask a question, because we do only have a few minutes left.
Yeah.
So.
Come on. Oops, sorry. There you go.
Can I raise a question? You hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, in what kind of argument for the existence of God is this? When William Craig is debating with, say, Richard Dawkins or some other atheist, can we imagine him bringing out this argument from the nature of grounding and saying to his audience, well, this is why you folks ought to believe in God? It doesn't seem to me that that's a very plausible scenario. The arguments that you might say have some bite or some force to them, say the design argument or the fine-tuning argument or maybe the moral argument. These seems to be things that you can sort of get your hands around in fairly short space of time and get it across, or at least make the claim that you have some facts here that God provides the best explanation for, okay? But in this case, it seems that we have an awful lot of a really big metaphysical structure, or at least one that seems to be fairly elaborate, that you have to buy into before the argument can get started. And that's illustrated by, you were talking to Professor Oppy about the nature of grounding and whether there's one grounding relation and so on and so forth. But it seems like you have to have a pretty huge, elaborate structure before the argument gets started. And which doesn't mean that it's not a significant piece of philosophy, but it means that the effectiveness is going to be really limited because it can only address people who are buying into this fairly elaborate structure already. Does that seem right to you?
Yeah. So is that for me, Professor? Yeah. So I would agree with you, but my sort of aim in this paper and sort of my general work on natural theology is to try to say that actually I believe there's a reservoir, someone could say as such, of evidence in a different realm from the physical realm that we've always spent a lot of time in, with cosmological, teleological arguments.
Sure.
Things like that. And if I'm honest, I've been persuaded quite a lot by some of Professor Oppy's arguments against things like cosmological arguments and things. But I do believe that there's a lot of great things that are happening in the field of metaphysics, where actually there is some data that metaphysicians are assuming without thinking about it in a theistic or theological sense or in philosophy of religion. So I'm trying to say, actually, maybe we can have a discussion about different type of data it will take some difficulty in understanding, conceiving of. But once that's done, and I'm making sure that I'm not bringing just esoteric, weird concepts, but concepts which are at the sense of metaphysics, and to say actually that God provides the best explanation here. And so in a similar way to that sort of medieval natural theological program of saying actually metaphysics has a place for God. Well, actually contemporary metaphysics, I would say, has a place for theism in providing the best explanation for some of this data that a lot of these philosophers are putting forward. That's sort of my aim in a way. I don't know if I'm successful, but
I understand what you're saying, and I think it's a significant philosophical project. Yeah. Of course, you're going to get not all theists will buy into the conception of God you're talking about. For instance, traditionally, most Christians anyway have wanted to say that creation is contingent, that God does not necessarily create. And so that's going to I don't know how that will affect your project, but it's different than what you were saying.
Yeah, I agree with you. That is a point, very important point, because it is something which plays a big part in the argument that there is a sort of an entailment of the data here. God is necessitating creation. I have in other works tried to find a way around it, to have some contingency. I won't go into it and bore the class as well. But there might be ways of making sense of having some form of that contingency in some way. But yeah, it's yeah.
So even a fairly somewhat elaborate presentation such as you've given, there's a lot more stuff in the background that still hasn't come out yet, obviously, or hasn't come out here. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I agree with you. Thank you for that.
Okay, so give it a chance.
Yeah. There you go.
Can I raise a question?
Yes, please.
Okay, my question is about God again. I am going to read it because if not, I am going to get confused. It emerged when I was reading your text. It says, if I understand well, the idea regarding God is that God is the fundamental explanation for the instantiation of the relation of grounding. And it is so because God grounds the non-fundamental the non-fundamental entities to the extent that he created them. And he created them because he's perfectly good. But I wonder whether perfect goodness can directly be derived from omnipotence, which is the attribute that makes God a modular trope. I say this because when I was reading your text, I had the impression that the same argument used to derive God's perfect goodness can be used to derive God's evil. By his infinite God knowledge, God could know all the consequences of his actions, and freely knowing that the specific action is a wrong action, he does it. It seems that something else is necessary that forces him to choose the good action, in which case he lacks freedom. So apparently, we have to choose between perfect goodness and freedom.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for that. That's really helpful. So in the article itself, and I didn't bring it out here, because the whole sort of background to me going down with this type of argument was trying to utilize a lot of Richard Swinburne's concepts and methodology in a way and modifying it and then utilizing it in the new context of metaphysics. And so I utilized his sort of conception of the nature of God, where there's a derivation. I would say the attributes themselves are identical to God, but he wouldn't say that. But there seems to be a derivation from omnipotence of the other attributes. But the way that we get to goodness, and I believe not, let's say, evil, from this derivation is the idea that God is perfectly free in the sense that he is not causally determined in any way. Given that he's omnipotent, he's not causally determined. Given that he's omnipotent as well, in some way that will lead to him knowing the truth value of every proposition. So assuming moral realism and there are moral truths, God will know what's good and God will know what's bad. And then there's a further assumption there that there is an inclination to perform the good. And so because God is, he's not determined in any way causally, and given that he knows the truth value of every proposition, that thing is good and that thing is bad, he will only be directed by reason. And so he will have then the inclination to perform the good action over the bad action. He will never have the inclination to perform the bad. And so why we perform bad action, someone would say with this Swinburnian framework, is because we are not free in the sense that we have causal determination in certain ways, or we have causal influences. So if I have the example of a cake and the Brussels sprouts, I love chocolate cake. It's lovely and loads of people like it. I don't like Brussels sprouts, but reason would guide me to go and eat Brussels sprouts because that will further my health and not the cake. But because I have a causal influence, my desires, I will then choose to eat the bad option or the worse option, which is eating the cake over the Brussels sprouts. But because God lacks any causal influences, he will then just have the inclination towards always performing the good and never performing the bad. So he will always just automatically, if there is one, perform a good action and no bad action. Now, there can obviously, because there's so many parts there, as even Professor Hasker was saying, that with these ideas, there's always so many parts that then always need to be argued for. Is there an inclination for the good? Are there moral truths? Does omnipotence lead to omniscience? So God knows of all moral truths. Now, my paper was very long, and I thank anyone that actually finished the paper. But to go more in depth and argue for it would be very difficult. But I would point people to people like Swinburne and others who have argued for those sort of things. And there might be ways to defend it, but there will always be pushback anyway. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Maybe just a statement. Hey, thanks so much for letting us be a part of this. It's really neat. You can tell the intelligence in the room, so thank you. As a business major, I think I'm intelligent in other manners and facets, but it's really cool to see you guys think.
Thank you.
Some thoughts that came up as I listened to you guys. I really like the statement that with philosophical theories, it always involves a cost-benefit analysis. And that really stood out to me because I'm a business major. And when I think about that, the grounding and the multi-layer structuring that you spoke of, I was trying to consider like how I might understand that from my world perspective. And so the idea was like, if I see a cat on the road and someone says, hey, that's a cat, then I reason that that's a cat and I have no other reason to believe anything otherwise. So that's the background that I come to with that understanding. So now, if someone points out to me, hey, this is God, and they define some attributes of God, but we have stated in this that there are 0 actual attributes of God because they can't be defined. It is still our way of reasoning that that's God. And so when we see different aspects of those same characteristics in this world that we live in the universe, that's how we might be able to reason like, oh, okay, I've seen this before. Now I'm using my ontological reasoning to say this must be God. And so if we start from the idea that everything is God and then work beyond, we'll be able to call back and say, okay, that tree, the way it grows, the way it blossoms, has the same characteristics as God in a sense. As humans procreate, we see the creative aspect. That looks like God's nature or that identity in which we give to God. And now I looked into the idea of what the term identity is, and it's the fact of being who you are or what a thing is. And there's a close relation with the word affinity. And I think that's another way that we could look at different aspects of creation, whether it's a table or a human or a cat or a tree. I think there could be a good argument in saying the affinity or the resemblance of the structure calls us back to that grounded idea that that's God. And so if God created everything, which I personally believe, we can see small aspects of him. Now, the last thought that was provoked in that is if we take the opposing view of like maybe naturalism or atheism or Buddhism or whatever that might be, we fall short of that mark because we continue to seek out something like, for instance, if we look at it like someone who believes in the universe or just in nature, they get to the point of nature, but they fall short of anything beyond that. Like H2O is a derivative of the universe, but it doesn't explain the universe. It's just a part of it. So, yeah, I don't know. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense. It was a really great presentation. I'm really grateful to have been a part of it. So if you can expand on anything or make sense of where I found myself in it, that would be greatly appreciated for any of you guys.
Awesome. Sorry, I don't know if I'm taking. Yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I do appreciate it because it was a long presentation. I just wanted to make sure that I sort of went through it. It's an argument that needs to be fleshed out in a way and does take a lot of time. So thank you for following that, and you did bring up very interesting points. And yeah, I don't know if Professor Oppy would have anything from the sort of a naturalistic perspective about that. So I think you were sort of saying that theism provides maybe an explanation for what you were saying, but I don't know if anyone else might have a specific point.
Not really. I mean, it's a kind of interesting question about what the costs are of supposing that there's something more than the natural universe and what the benefits are from supposing that there's something more than the natural universe. And you might think, well, the kind of benefit is we get an explanation. We get an explanation for the existence of the natural universe. Then historically, the question that naturalists ask was, well, okay, but what explains the new thing that explains the existence of the natural universe? What's your explanation for that? And you might say, well, it sort of explains itself. It has to be, or something like that. And then what the naturalist is going to say coming back is, well, okay, but if you can suppose that something has that status, why not just suppose that the universe has that status, right? That way you don't need the extra entity and you've still got to the same kind of explanatory position. Right now, one of the kind of great things about philosophy is that people disagree about almost everything. There are some people who think that this set of moves kind of works out well for naturalists. There are other people who think that it doesn't.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add to that point with, and I do, and I just thank you also, Professor Oppy, for engaging with this. And yeah, something I really wanted to highlight with this this argument, this presentation itself, is that it's really trying to get to the question of saying, let's say we assume that reality is in this certain way. And some people do want to make this assumption about there being this layered structured reality and there being fundamental entities at the bottom. What best fits the bill for that fundamental entity that accounts for everything? Because what is quite interesting here is, and what I was trying to list before, is a lot of these people who affirm the reality of grounding, the reality of there being a layered structure, the reality of there being absolutely fundamental entities, are non-theistic. So they will not affirm theism. So they will even say, yeah, there is an absolute fundamental entity, but it's the universe itself, or it's atoms or something else. So I'm saying, speaking to those people, and there's a wide variety of them in metaphysics, well, the best way of making sense of what is that entity is to say, whatever theory we're putting forward, what has the most theoretical virtue? And I was trying to argue that actually with theism, we seem to get something that has such great theoretical virtue because the commitments at that fundamental level are very few, and then you get all the explanation that you want. But if you go with this majority view of priority monism or pluralism or other views, and you are assuming that they are the fundamental thing, you're going to have more commitments in theism, and you might not explain the data as well. Or if you do explain the data as well, given those commitments, the virtues are going to be less than theism. So even if we were to take skeptics out of the conversation and we kept a lot of the majority of philosophers who are foundationalists, it seems to be the case that I would say theism provides a better explanation given its virtuous nature than the options of the non-theistic ones that a lot of these philosophers would be affirming. That's what I was trying to say. Yeah.
Can I raise another question? I'm sorry.
Okay, you can ask one more question from a student and then
Okay.
There's two more questions. This one, the next one from Dr. Susana.
Well, your comments just now maybe address a part of my question, but this is specifically for you, Joshua, and also Graham would like to make a comment on this. That would be awesome too. Okay, so you say that God is the thing that allows for the existence of non-fundamental entities and also for the grounding relations between the levels of those entities. This seems to be the case only if the God we are talking about has the attributes traditionally associated with the Abrahamic God. He's the only God, all-powerful, etc. If you agree with this, then what implications does this have for the conversation about the existence of a God or gods? If not, then what part of my question would you adjust? So,
yeah. So the argument works with it. Yeah, definitely with a certain conception of God, because if God is lacking, for example, goodness or knowledge of truths, then you're not going to have what you want. You're not going to get this entailment that I'm trying to say that is there. So it would only work for a certain concept of God, and it might be the one that is affirmed by the Abrahamic religions and maybe some similar religions to that. But at the end of the day, what I would say I'm trying to do and others are trying to do was that we're trying to build a theory and say, okay, what concept of God, if there is a concept of God that has some truth value, which is the one that, again, has the most virtuous sort of aspects to it? And I would believe that the concept of God that I'm affirming here, which might coincide with the Abrahamic conception, allows us to have the most virtuous theory because it accounts for our data and gives us the most the fewest fundamental commitments. So this might mean other concepts of God might not do as well in this analysis. But in this specific analysis, I was saying this is the concept of God that I believe leads to the conclusion that I'm trying to argue for. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll add just one thing at this point. It seems to me very controversial to suppose that God's a trope. That's, I think, not a widespread view amongst Abrahamic philosophers. And so when you were saying, you might think that it's the Abrahamic conception, you're right to be kind of raising a question in everybody's mind about whether that's so.
Yeah, sorry. Just to, would you like me to respond to that, or Tedla? Okay, yeah. I definitely agree with you. I think 99% of people wouldn't conceive of God in that way. But I think generally I would say when we have the Abrahamic sort of view, it's sort of such a coarse-grained sort of level where there is a God. He's, maybe some people might say in a classical theistic sense, is simple, has these attributes, and that's it. But then when we go to more fine-grained level, I'm trying to say, well, postulating him as a trope in this sense, we can get what we want with the coarse-grained analysis that we put forward. So the Abrahamic religions might be at some level, but then when we go to a more fine-grained level philosophically, I'm trying to say, well, actually a trope can allow us to have what we want with our sort of theorizing. But again, it's going to be a lot of people will have to stomach that first and say, well, what is this that I'm doing here? Yeah.
Susana? Dr. Susana, you can go ahead.
Thank you. What do you think about consciousness, like fundamental explanation, consciousness, just because many philosophers and scientists are exploring the possibility of consciousness as the last explanation of reality.
Yeah. So yeah, I would be interested in that, but I think, and this is a lot of influence on by Professor Oppy on my thinking and Richard Swinburne as well. It's about, well, again, it's that sort of trade-off that we need to make. What are the commitments? If it is consciousness, what is that consciousness? How many things do we have to be committed ontologically and ideologically when it comes to theorizing about that thing? And so for me, it will be just saying that we need to, whoever is putting forward that view needs to put forward that view at a fine-grained level. And so then we can analyze and say, does theism, consciousness, or some other option do better theoretically when it comes to the commitments, and then with its explanatory power, the data. So yeah, I just think it will have to be someone has to put forward the theory, and then we can see and weigh it and say what are the virtues can be found with that theory.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Oppy, if you have anything to say, to add, feel free to close.
Just thanks for letting me come and be part of the class. Cheers.
Okay. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Sijuwade, or I should say Joshua, and Professor Oppy again. Thank you so much. Nice to meet you, Dr. Susana. And
thank you.
Everyone, thank you for your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?